this video, I want to talk briefly about limiters and how you can use those in the mixdown process. Now, a limiter is really an extreme form of compressor. It's actually defined as a compressor that has a higher ratio than 20:1, so a very, very radical form of compression. And it's generally used to make sure that your sound at any cost will not go over or exceed a certain level or certain threshold which you can set yourself. This is why it's particularly useful at the end of a mastering chain, just to make sure that all of the processing you've done prior to it getting to the actual master output that's going out into the world, it's just to ensure that there's no kind of digital clipping or distortion happening because you're actually in some, on occasion like redlining and pushing too much audio volume through the master. Now, in the case of mixdowns, the limiters are a pretty useful tool to have on individual channels, depending on what kind of processing you've done and depending on what kind of sound you're using. In the case of rhythmic sounds, if we look at this drum loop and just visually go through it, it certainly looks like none of these peaks are actually hitting the maximum level that they're allowed to hit before you go into the red. Now, if we turn this limiter on, and the reason I'm using the Pro L2 is because it has a very good visual display, so we can see exactly what the limiter is doing. Now, my goal with using a limiter in this way is simply to catch any unexpected peaks that might have my group bus or my individual channel launching into the red. So let's just listen to this loop, and we shouldn't see any form of clipping happening or any form of limiting happening as we send this audio through the limiter. So what we can see here is actually that there were two moments during this sample where, despite what we're looking at visually here, we are actually peaking by almost 2 decibels. So the way that I would use a limiter here is simply to put it on the end of this chain, and each time those peaks are happening, it's simply ducking the volume down so that we're not redlining. And you can see this, you can see the evidence of this in our metering here to the far right on Ableton. So first of all, I'll play the loop with the limiter on, and you'll see that it's not exceeding, it's not going into the orange there or the red. And if I take the limiter off, there's a couple of moments there where we're going into the kind of red zone. So that's really the way that I would use a limiter in the mixdown process. Now, kind of understanding what's happening here to your sound so that it's literally being kind of squashed ever so slightly. It's not making any audible difference to the sound at all, but you're just like preserving that kind of little bit of headroom. Now, this becomes much more of an important tool when you start looking at, say, bus mixes or groups of sounds that you've put together, and you can find that the effect of channeling 8 different parts into one sort of output funnel means that you are actually exceeding the amount of volume that you are allowed to be putting down that channel. And that's where a limiter will come in to very gently just catch those peaks. In an ideal world, you'd have actually staged your levels correctly so that you actually don't need the limiter to be there. So it's really used as just a fail-safe. And just as a reminder here to what's actually happening, what's happening when you use a limiter is that those the attack points, those transients or attack points that are exceeding a certain threshold, are being brought closer to the quieter moments within your sample. So for example, if we go very, very radical with this limiter and we reduce the we expand the threshold to 30 decibels, the limiter is going to kick in at much lower levels than we have it set to when it's set to 0 dB. At 0 dB, all it's going to do is catch any peaks that go over 0 dB, right? So if we play it now, and what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to resample this, and that means I'm routing this directly back into Ableton using resampling, and I'm actually going to record these 2 bars just so you can see visually what's actually happening to the sound when we smash it into a limiter. And obviously turning it on will help when I'm doing this. So here we go again. So now you can see that this sound has been, absolutely decimated by the limiter, and these quiet moments here have become basically as loud as our kicks and snares. If we zoom further into the waveform, we can see that there's actually a lot of points here where the wave itself is being completely flattened off at the top of the waveform, and that is a form of distortion that's happening that's making it do that, as we saw earlier on in a previous tutorial when I was talking about saturation. So on the face of it, yes, you are making your mix sound a lot louder, and we can just A-B these. Let's just take this back down again, and we'll just A-B these. So technically speaking, if you look at the actual volume here, the volume of this particular part, whilst it sounds a hell of a lot louder than the volume of this part, technically it's actually quieter. So it's hitting a lower peak when it comes to its decibels. But when we look at what it's doing to the sound, and how on this original sample there's all this lovely silence here and all these really quiet nuanced moments, those no longer exist in the new version of the sample that we've created. So this is just an example of a very extreme form of limiting. But just know that when you smash your sound into a limiter, unless you're specifically looking for this kind of effect, you just need to bear in mind that each time, each decibel that you bring the quietest part of the sample closer to the loudest part of the sample is a little bit of space that is no longer available for other sounds to occupy within your mix. So it's all a very kind of subtle trade-off at the end of the day. Anyhow, I hope you've enjoyed this video on limiting, and if you have, please like and subscribe to my YouTube channel for more content in a similar vein. And also check out my website at mixingmasteringmentoring.com, where I offer one-to-one mentoring sessions as well as mixing and mastering services. And you can also find PDFs on my site for free download, which will give you all kinds of tips and tricks that will help you turbocharge your own productions. So I hope you've enjoyed watching today, and I'll see you next time.